Last week, the ANC's policy conference was billed as the final nail in the coffin for a drive to nationalise the country's mines. Now resource nationalism is seen as the next threat to the global mining sector. Peter Leon, partner at Webber Wentzel Bowens, joins us in studio to shed some light on what implications these two ideologies may have on the economy. Thanks very much for joining us this evening.
Welcome, Bronwyn.
I'm going to ask you to unpack these two. Are they different?
Yeah, the one is an extreme form of the other. So nationalisation is the most extreme form of resource nationalism, but resource nationalism is an issue throughout the world, and it's not just confined to the developing world, Africa and Latin America. You can see it in Canada, where the potash acquisition by BHP Billiton was blocked by the Canadian government. And you see it in Australia. I mean, last week when the mineral resource rent tax went into effect, and in fact some of the thinking behind that informed the ANC Research Committee's report on nationalisation, where they recommended a 50% resource rent tax as opposed to the effective 22.5% in Australia, which is only on coal and iron ore. The ANC research report said it should be on all commodities. Now, the good news is, and there's some good news, is the ANC policy conference last week, although it rejected nationalisation outright, but on the taxation issues, it really kicked them into touch. There was no outright adoption of the research committee's report, and I think that is positive. One has to see what will happen at Mangaung in the middle of December when the elective conference takes place, and there all the issues over the ANC succession, which this has now all got mixed into. So, you know, one needs to look out to what, you know, how many delegates Limpopo lines up for the conference and things like that. But I think the outcome of the conference, although the uncertainty continues, nationalisation per se is out the window in this country. What the policy conference really talked about was targeted nationalisation, whatever that means, which they said would have to happen on the balance of evidence. In other words, you know, if it was seen to be correct. And clearly if that happened, if publicly listed companies were suddenly taken over by the state, that would have a huge impact on the market and indeed on the country.
Politics, gentlemen, will drive markets, and especially if there's any uncertainty involved. Chris, are you keeping your eye very carefully on what unfolds in policy discussion?
Yeah, undoubtedly. But, you know, I take heart from what Trevor Manuel said a few months ago, and he was quite categorical about it. He said, look, even if, and I'm paraphrasing here, even if the government was given all of this on a plate, they expropriated all of these mining companies without any payment at all, they actually couldn't afford to run them. And I think that was a breath of fresh air. It made an awful lot of common sense.
Let alone pay for them.
Well, exactly. Yeah. Yes. He was saying even if you got them for nothing.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So I think he tried to dimension the size of the problem, trying to run these things. And I think around the world, you know, governments do realise that yes, they can take things just so far, but physically trying to run these operations is a very, very difficult prospect.
Yeah. Look, I agree with that. But I mean, the other concern I do have coming out of the policy conference is, and this is consistent with direction of government policy generally at the moment, is a much greater role for the state mining company. At the moment, as you probably know, it's simply a very small subsidiary of the Central Energy Fund. It has one mining operation in Mpumalanga, which is relatively small. It started last year. It's got about 23 prospecting rights, but it's certainly not active. Now, the research report envisages a much bigger role for it, and the policy conference endorsed that. And what the policy conference was saying in its report was that all the government's interests in mining companies should be sort of cantilevered into the state mining company, and this should become, I suppose, the South African version of Codelco in Chile, but on a, you know, on a sort of multi-mineral scale, not simply in copper. So, you know, I do think that's a bit of a warning light, because I, you know, certainly don't think the state should be competing on that scale with the private sector, and I'm not sure the state necessarily has the skills to be running a mining company.
Kevin, let's bring you in here.
We are seeing far greater state intervention, especially in emerging markets, and especially because of the success of China in the last 20 years. And so whether it's Codelco in Chile or Vale in Brazil, what do you think?
Vale is privately owned, is privatized, although it's indirectly.
It is, but it has an enormous amount of government intervention or influence involved as well. What do you think the landscape is going forward, and do you think it's an efficient model?
No, I don't think it's an efficient model. That's my perspective. Perhaps you might say an ideological perspective. I don't think. You know, if you look, to me, what's really interesting is to look at the rest of Africa, and I've done a lot of work in other African mining jurisdictions, and generally speaking, the trend is completely away from state mining companies. Okay, Tanzania has recently revived its own state mining company. If you go to a company like Nigeria, they've got rid of it, and Ghana doesn't really have one, although it has a free carry, a 10% free carry in rights. But generally the state in Africa has retreated from mining because of the very bad experiences the state had in the 1970s, and you know, structural justice programs and things like that that they had to embark on. Whereas in this country we seem to be moving away from the Mbeki era of you know, more of a private sector, public sector, quite carefully delineated, to a much more interventionist state in the economy generally, not just mining.
But what about Australia? What are your thoughts on that economy? I recently sat down with Mark Kutufani. We had a long discussion. He's very concerned about the legislation in Australia when it comes to the mining sector. So this is not a situation unique to South Africa.
No, it isn't. And I mean, clearly, I mean, the Gillard government in Australia, it led to the fall of Kevin Rudd, as I'm sure he talked about, although they're the same party. You know, the Gillard administration has put into effect this resource rent tax, but it's in a much more limited form than the one that Rudd was proposing. But it's interesting that now, you know, the big mining companies have gone along with it because they negotiated, I think, at the end, a fairly good deal for them. The smaller mining companies are very much against it. The most recent development now is it looks as though the Queensland government and possibly the Western Australian government are going to take the federal government to court on the grounds that this tax is unconstitutional because it affects the taxing powers of the states. So, you know, I think Australia, there is certainly an issue there, but I mean, the Australians are not proposing a state mining company, they're proposing greater taxes.
Which, as you say, the mining companies are still pushing back on. Kutufani wasn't at all positive about Australia and their regime.
You know, our take is we're not surprised to see this kind of change in policy, not only from the South African government, but other governments as well. We saw the trend in the 70s when you had an increase in commodity prices, and governments essentially wanted more of the cut and decided to fiddle with the regulatory framework, and we saw waves of nationalisation in the 70s as well. From the Sims report that was released and which is currently being discussed and so on, the one thing we're encouraged by was that it looks like nationalisation has more or less been rejected. There will be more state intervention, however. We were encouraged that the process to get mineral rights is potentially going to be more of an auction-based procedure instead of it being a
first in, first assessed.
First in, first out, and first assessed, which we don't think is very efficient, and it leads to a whole bunch of inefficiencies and so on. So those were the two positives. And then the other positive is that it actually introduced a rent-based policy framework, which we think is very good, but it doesn't go far enough. So while they are planning to take more of a rental income from a marginal return above an amount that they deemed at 15%, we think that they should also do it on the other side. So marginal mines should actually get far greater tax assistance. And what that will do is create, well, support employment at the bottom end of the commodity cycle. And we think create a far better system for the government as a whole, for the nation, and also a leveler playing field for the mines as a whole.
There's certainly something in the whole idea of auctioning rights, which in fact I think the research report got from Liberia. Very few mining countries auction rights. Oil-rich countries auction their oil blocks, but mining rights generally, the normal international model is first in, first assessed. In other words, the first in line gets the right. In South Africa, there's a black empowerment preference. If you're a black-owned company, you would get reviewed first. But having said that, there are inefficiencies in the system. In fact, in South Africa, we even had issues of corruption with rights suddenly, being put on the back when other rights are put in the front. So the principle of auctioning rights, actually a very interesting one, was obviously result in a capital windfall for the state. But the problem is the very few mining jurisdictions do it. I mean, the ones that do are Liberia and Mongolia, and I think Kazakhstan. So three or four countries. If we implemented this in South Africa, my concern is what would happen to sunk capital costs. In other words, if a platinum mine, if its rights expire in 10 years' time, what happens if it goes into the auctioning process and it doesn't win the bid? What happens to its mine? And those things aren't dealt with in the Sims report. And in my discussions with the ANC, I haven't really got any answers on them.